Coming up, two of what I find to be the most shallow, intellectually lazy dismissals of critical race theory.
Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz.
All right, so building on the work I've already done in the first two videos in this series, if you haven't seen those yet, it might be worth watching. I try to cover the origins of CRT and then the development and application of CRT. And now I want to spend some time in this video and at least one more talking about some responses to critical race theory. Today I just want to cover, keep it pretty short and simple, and cover two of what I find to be some of the most frustrating dismissals of CRT. I do want to cover eventually some of the more thoughtful and the more important maybe critiques, things to be aware of, but today's just going to be some of the more simplistic kind of popular talking points that I've heard quite a bit of. And so I'm just going to name them and then discuss them a little bit and why I find them frustrating. So the first one is the accusation that it's Marxist, or it's neo-Marxist, or it's cultural Marxism. This comes up quite a bit, and people will frequently level this accusation at critical race theory as a whole. And so what I want to do with this critique, I'm going to explain why I find it a little frustrating, but honestly what it boils down to is typically when someone kind of rants with that label, uses that label quickly, it signals to me that they probably haven't actually really studied it. And the reason I can say that is because you can follow up with two questions. If someone says, well, it's Marxist, you can follow up with two questions to explore whether they actually know what that means. One is, you can say, what is Marxist about critical race theory? And then two, how is that bad? Those are two really simple follow-up questions to the accusation of Marxism. How exactly is it Marxist? What is Marxist about it, and why is that bad? And maybe you'll find some people can respond in some ways. I could guess at some of the responses people would say. But typically, that accusation kind of falls apart really quickly with just two really simple follow-up questions. And so what I want to say a few things about this. I want to unpack this a little bit because it's a very popular talking point. On a very, very vague, broad way, critical race theory kind of comes out of the cultural, intellectual milieu of Marxist and post-Marxist thought. Kind of. I mean, that's kind of true. However, Derek Bell, one of the founders, intellectual founders of critical race theory, actually took pretty serious effort to make it clear near the end of his life that he did not use Marx's tools, analytical tools, to develop the legal critique that he put forward that would become critical race theory. He actually explicitly said, listen, I did not use Marx or Marxism or Marxist thought to come up with the tools that I came up with. So that's one wrinkle in that whole accusation right away. But there are a few broad ways, and you can watch, maybe I'll link to it, but I have a short discussion of kind of defining some of the pillars of Marxism as a philosophy, as a kind of way to analyze culture. Or actually to analyze economics and societal structures is what Marx originally was trying to do, to be more accurate. And there are a few ways in which it kind of resonates with Marx, and one is in some of its materialist bent in terms of analysis and thought. And by materialist, I mean looking at structures. Marx was intensely materialistic in analyzing economic structures in particular, and to the extent that critical race theory is really rigidly materialistic around legal and social structures, I can kind of see some resonance there. And also, it does kind of, and especially in the popular form that I talked about in video 2, it gets kind of builds on some of what's called conflict theory, which comes out of Hegel, which is what Marx was partly influenced by. I'm trying to avoid going down rabbit trails here. But there's kind of something called conflict theory. Marx applied it to class structure. But critical race theory sometimes can pull on conflict theory as it relates to racial groups and then social revolutions. And so I can see some resonance there when the materialism and the conflict theory. However, this is really important to say, Marx is not the only one who talked about, Marx is not the only materialistic philosopher or social analyzer, and also he wasn't the only one who used conflict theory. And I think it's more accurate to say, and from reading critical race theory texts, they refer to other philosophers. From my view, from my study, I've seen them refer to other philosophers much more frequently. People like Michel Foucault, much more of an influence on critical race theory broadly than Marx, from what I can see, or Herbert Marcuse. And both of those thinkers, Michel Foucault in his analysis of power in the way power is exercised in culture and the way he looked at marginalization of certain people, and the way that power was exercised to other people. That is much more influential, I think, in the stream of critical race theory. And also Mark Hughes's work on more of the revolutionary kind of agitating for the overthrow of the oppressor work, particularly in Mark Hughes's work around things like critiquing free speech as a tool of oppression. That was something Mark Hughes talked openly about, was that free speech itself was a way that the oppressor used, was a tool the oppressor used to continue oppression. Stuff like that is much more directly influential in CRT. And so I get really frustrated with the neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist critique, typically because it's just an empty signifier that people use to try to dismiss something without actually engaging with it. And if you push on a little bit farther and ask to demonstrate how is it Marxist and what's bad about that, you can see that there actually probably has not been a lot of careful thought. Now, if someone can respond along lines I just did with some connecting points philosophically, analytically, and point to why they find that problematic, then more power to you. And that's an actual conversation that we're having. But to just blast it as Marxist and just pretend like that means you don't need to think about it anymore, really frustrating. So that's the first critique, lazy critique, in my view. Second intellectually lazy critique is similar, but a little more specific, and it's some version of this phrase, which is, the problem with CRT is that it divides the world into the oppressor and the oppressed. I hear that phrase so many times, and honestly, kind of like the first accusation or the first critique, typically when I hear that, it immediately is a signal to me that, oh, well, this person really probably hasn't actually studied CRT. Now, maybe you listen to that, maybe you heard me say that and you think, no, I can demonstrate how this is happening in CRT and CRT thought. Maybe that's the case. However, in my experience, 9.5 times out of 10, almost every time when someone uses that phrase, it's because they heard someone else who was very dismissive and against critical race theory, they heard them use that phrase and they're just simply repeating it because it's something that they was told to them that's a tenet of critical race theory. And I just simply think that it's not true, broadly speaking, to say that critical race theory starts by assuming the entire world is divided into oppressor and oppressed classes. As I covered in hopefully in helpful detail in the previous two videos, it's more accurate than rather than starting with that oppressor-oppressed binary view. It's more accurate to say critical race theory is trying to critically examine how race has been constructed in society, in laws and social structures. It's trying to critically interrogate and figure out how has race and racial categories been built up and encoded in our societal structures. That's really a better starting point than to say it's dividing the world into the oppressor and the oppressed. And then critical race theory is trying to say if racism race has been built into these structures, how then is racism functioning in those same structures that are perpetuating racial categories? Now, I want to say that it is true that some critical race theorists do try then to go another step and try to examine how might racial categories and then the racism coming out of those be having an oppressive role and be functioning as oppressive and causing oppression along racial lines in our society. Examining oppression is very much a part of critical race theory. So it's not to try to split these things too far apart. That is true. And it is also true, I will say, that some, particularly of the more cynical bent, some theorists of a more cynical bent will assume oppression exists everywhere and then go trying to look for it. And that gets into some of the potentially more nuanced, thoughtful complications or critiques that we can have and talk about CRT. But it's not true full scope that all of CRT and all these theorists just assume the world is divided into these simplistic binary categories of oppressor and oppressed, and then they're just trying to reify those categories. It's just not true, and it's not the starting point of a lot of these theorists. But it's also important to say that people like Derek Bell, agree or disagree with his tools or whatever, he looked around the world and simply saw oppression happening and was trying to ask why and what's supporting that and what's perpetuating that oppression. So it's just so much more complicated to just simply say, well, the problem with it is it just divides the oppressor or the world into oppressor and oppressed. So this is just a really frustrating phrase that I'm hearing a lot. I think it's getting a lot of traction in these kind of shallow, lazy critiques of CRT. And it's something that I really want to push back on and ask for just more careful thought than dismissing something out of that phrase. I think that to lend a hand, to tip my hat or whatever, to what people might be trying to get at when they say that is they might be trying to respond to the kind of Robin DiAngelo stream, which says on a popular level something like, if you are born white, you're automatically born racist in our society, which means you're born as an oppressor. And people are really bristling, understandably so, bristling against that kind of simplistic equation that if you're just born in a certain racial category, you are born as an oppressor, with whether you've done anything or whether you have anything to say about it. People are bristling against that, and I think that's, from what I can tell, that's kind of where this critique of this lazy response of like, well, the problem is it divides the world into these two classes. I think that's where it's coming from, but I want to hit pause because Robin DiAngelo does not represent all of critical race theory. I want to hit pause on that critique and say, let's try to get a little more nuanced, complicated, and actually try to, if we're going to critique critical race theory, let's try to understand what they're actually saying. And what they're actually saying is, let's examine critically through history, through law, how race functions in human societies. How has it been built? How has it been maybe created? How does it function? And yes, maybe some of that function is oppressive. Quite a bit of it actually can be. So those are two, what I see as very lazy critiques: the Marxist dismissal and the oppressor-oppressed dismissal. And ultimately, I've repeated this a few times, I think, already in this short video, but ultimately, both of these critiques just simply, what I see is they come down to this attempt to deploy these kind of empty rhetorical signifiers, which is more of to signal, hey, I am just dismissing this thing, and I'm following these other pundits or talking heads or commentators who have used these words. So I agree with them, and I'm just going to use these words to signal that I'm in their camp, so to speak, and I'm just going to invalidate and dismiss this entire world of thought by deploying these words. And that's really the problem here, is that when people use these terms and can't actually defend what the terms mean, how they apply, what they're actually really critiquing underneath, then they're just empty. And it's not helpful to the discussions that we need to have. And it's not helpful to understanding people across different ideological lines and the thoughts that they're actually trying to put forward. So there you have it. There's two what I see as lazy critiques. I hope this was helpful. I hope this was thought-provoking to you. If you have heard other similar critiques that you want to chime in on, please post them below. If you have other thoughts and ways you push back or nuance the things that I said, please post them below. On this series, I do want to get into what I see as more thoughtful, productive, and frankly helpful critiques of critical race theory as a field, and specifically some critical race theorists. So I am going to get there, but if you have questions along those lines, please let me know. And as always, thanks for checking this out. I hope that you found this at least somewhat stimulating intellectually. Thanks.